Let me guess, you're looking into getting the A7 III because you're interested in getting a full-frame camera for a pretty good price. However, you also noticed that this camera has been out for a few years, so now you're wondering, is this still a good deal? Should I still go for the A7 III or should I save up my money and go for another camera? That's why in this video, I want to share with you my experiences and my thoughts on using the A7 III for the last 2 years and hopefully answer the question of this video, is the Sony A7 III still a good choice? When it comes to the exterior of the A7 III, I am pretty pleased with it. The first reason is that it's pretty heavy and it has a big grip, and this may sound contradictory to the other things that I've said about this camera because it is too heavy. Yes, it's too heavy for vlogging in my opinion, although it kind of depends on how strong you are. But no, it's not too heavy if you are a freelancer or videographer and you want to take steady shots. This camera, because it's on the heavier side, it feels really good when you're holding it. It's just not that great for vlogging in my opinion. And talking about vlogging, this camera has a tilt screen and not a flippy screen, and at first, not having a flippy screen wasn't a thing for me because I was going to use this camera for a video production company that I wanted to set up and not for YouTube. But then things got out of control and now I am a YouTuber. And as a YouTuber, not having a flippy screen is a deal breaker for me. Now again, this is very personal. I really prefer having a flippy screen and being able to see myself and see what's happening because right now I am trusting the camera completely. However, I have built the majority of this channel, like all my talking head videos, with this camera, so there are some to say for that. So it's all personal preference. For me, it's all about convenience, and having a flippy screen is way more convenient than not having a flippy screen, but especially if you're mostly behind the camera, this is not really an issue. The tilt screen will do just fine. And something that I do like about this screen is the fact that it's a touch screen. So this means that if you want to put focus on something and you want to isolate a specific subject, all you have to do is just tap on the screen and it will focus in on that subject. So this camera also has a lot of custom buttons, which we will get into in a little bit, and it has not one but 2 SD card slots. And especially if you're a freelancer, the worst thing that could happen to you if you're, for example, filming a wedding is that you're missing data, your data is corrupted, you can't save it, and now you miss the most important moment of that day. With 2 SD card slots, that will not happen because you'll always have a backup. Alright, let's talk about the image quality. Now, like I said in the beginning of the video, this is a full-frame camera that shoots 4K up to 30 frames per second and 120 frames per second in 1080p. And if you're in Europe, that means that you can shoot up to 25 frames per second in 4K and 100 frames per second in 1080p. The image quality, in my opinion, is really good, and I definitely think that it still holds up today, and it also performs really well in low light, which I think is pretty important. Now, let's be honest, $2,000 or however much it is right now, you'd have to check the link in the description, but when I got it for about $2,000. It's a lot of money. Regardless of whether the camera is worth it, $2,000 is still $2,000. I feel like, at least for me, when I spend that kind of money, I just want to make sure that it works well in all kinds of situations, and I can confidently say that the A7 III has not disappointed in this regard. It's really good in daylight, it's really good in low light situations. So whatever you're going to be shooting, I think that you cannot go wrong when it comes to the image quality of the A7 III. Since we're still on the subject of image quality, the A7 III also offers a lot of picture profiles. Now, one of the picture profiles that I was most interested in was the S-Log2, but it also offers Cine 1, Cine 2. It offers quite a few different picture profiles. With this camera, I've personally been shooting a lot in S-Log2 and the neutral color profile. I think the S-Log2 is pretty good on this camera. I haven't really had any issues with it other than this kind of like purpley tone, but that was very easy to correct in post, and since you're shooting an S-Log2, you're going to color grade anyway, so that's not really an issue. Now, before we move on to the autofocus, I do want to talk about the custom buttons on the A7 III. I use those all the time, and I highly recommend anyone to take advantage of this, and I'm not just saying that because the Sony menu is not intuitive. It actually makes using the camera so much easier and so much faster. And if you're a freelancer, you will not have to fiddle around with different settings and go into the menu. You can just press a few buttons and look very professional in front of your client. So what I did, for example, is I programmed my C1 button as my picture profile button and my C2 button as my white balance button. And the FN button at the back of the camera is also very useful because here you can dedicate a bunch of settings to the menu on screen, so you don't have to go into the Sony menu and you can just easily find your settings right on the screen. But to make it even easier, you can program 2 modes on your camera, the 1 and the 2 right here. So I saved all of my real-time settings, as I like to call them, to mode 1. So this includes 4K, 25 frames per second, and a shutter speed of 1/50th. And then I saved all of my slow motion settings to mode 2, so 1080p, 100 frames per second, and a shutter speed of 1/200th. So now instead of having to go into the Sony menu, switch 4K to 1080p in order to go to 100 frames per second, I can just switch the mode from 1 to 2 and vice versa. Since we're speaking about features, there is obviously one feature that we cannot not talk about, and that is the autofocus. And the autofocus on the A7 III, from my experience, comes with a little bit of a manual. Initially, I got the A7 III because I read a lot of good stories about the autofocus on the A7 III. It has face autofocus and not eye autofocus in video mode. Although I think it's good, I've also had a few hiccups with the A7 III. The first focusing issue that I had with this camera was when I was shooting in S-Log2 at a very wide aperture of 2.8. My ear was in focus, or the flowers behind me were in focus, or literally anything else was in focus but me. And sometimes my camera just decided to have this little bouncing party where it was hunting for focus. Now the way that I overcame this issue was by shooting at an aperture of f4 at minimum. Now the second focusing issue I have is that the face autofocus is immediately turned off every time that I have the control with smartphone setting on. Now I'm not even using my smartphone, it's not even connected to my smartphone, but whenever I have that setting on, the face autofocus is turned off and it won't follow my face. So the way that I solve this is by turning that setting off and turning airplane mode on. Now turning on airplane mode is a very simple way of overcoming this issue, I agree, but it's just one of those details that just makes the camera a little less pleasant to use on a day-to-day basis, especially when you're in front of the camera. Now despite of those issues, because I've been able to overcome them, I do still think that the autofocus of the A7 III is good. I think it's pretty responsive, I think it works well, and if you're mostly behind the camera, then this is not an issue for you whatsoever and the autofocus will be great. When you're getting a new camera, it's really important to know how long you can use a camera before it dies on you, before you need to recharge it or get a new battery. When it comes to the battery life of the A7 III, I think that it's pretty good. Depending on how much you film and how much you film in 4K and all that stuff, I can pretty much film an entire day with 2 batteries. When I film talking head videos like I'm doing right now, usually after about 1.5 hours of filming, I still have about 40 to 50% less, but let's just say 40 to be safe. I personally have 3 batteries for the A7 III, even though I usually use 2, it's always good to have just an extra one just in case. And since the A7 III doesn't come with a charger, I'll make sure to link a very cheap dual charger in my description. It's one that I use all the time and that I would recommend you to get as well without breaking the bank. Now, if you've been doing a little bit of research on the A7 III, you've probably read or heard about overheating. And the overheating is real. When I film for 45 to 60 minutes, my camera overheats and I cannot use it for another 20 minutes. But don't worry, there's a fix for that because now my camera never overheats and I can easily film for like 2 or 3 hours without the camera overheating. So the way to fix this is in the menu. All you have to do is go to setup 2 and then page 2 and then change the auto power off temperature to high instead of standard. And ever since I changed that one setting, I've never had any overheating issues anymore. I can easily film for 2 hours. And that actually brings me to my next point, because the A7 III, like a lot of other cameras, has a 30-minute recording limit. Now, like I said, it's pretty common for a camera to have a 30-minute recording limit, but if you're going to use this camera for interviews or for talking head videos, you want to keep it in mind because after 30 minutes, it's going to stop the recording. So you either have to pause the interview so you can press record again, or you're going to have to need another camera so that you can press record again without interrupting the interview. And the same goes for talking head videos like this one for YouTube. Actually, let me see where I'm at. Okay, we're at 21 minutes. We have 9 more minutes, so I'm just going to press pause and record again. All right, we can continue. Now, of course, if you do travel videos or B-roll videos or events, this may not even be relevant for you, but I just wanted to mention it. If you will be using the A7 III for video, you're probably also interested in the audio capabilities. I personally really like the audio that comes out of the A7 III when you shoot with an external microphone like the Rode VideoMic Pro. In the Sony menu, you will find a few audio settings that you can take advantage of. There is one thing that I want to mention, and that is that the mic jack is pretty vulnerable. After using this camera for a few months, I went to Belfast and I really wanted to vlog the entire trip, but unfortunately a lot of the audio was messed up because the mic jack was broken. Up until this day, I'm still not sure how it happened because I'm very careful with my gear. I had to send it in, and unfortunately I'm not the exception. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. Now, after I sent it in once, I never had to send it in again, so that is definitely a good thing, but I think that it's important to mention it because when I bought this camera, I had no idea that the mic jack was vulnerable, so now if you're going to get the camera, at least you'll know. There's actually a way to avoid this, and that is by getting one of those Sony external microphones that connect with your camera via the hot shoe, so that way you don't have to use a cable and you don't have to use your mic jack whatsoever. So I'll also make sure to put a link in the description to a Sony microphone that I've heard really good things about and that I feel comfortable with recommending to you. It's time to answer the question that we asked at the beginning of this video, and that is the A7 III still worth it? Or in other words, should you get this camera? And the answer is yes and no. Of course, it all depends on your specific needs as a videographer and your budget, so take it with a grain of salt, but here are my thoughts. I think that the A7 III is a very versatile and still very relevant full-frame camera, so I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in shooting B-roll, travel films, events, weddings, or if you're looking to get into videography. Especially if the A7 III is within your budget, I think that it's a great option for at least the next few years. Now, I personally don't think it's a great camera for people like me who are mostly in front of the camera and are a one-person production, or if you're looking for an easy-to-use run-and-gun camera, simply because I think that the A7 III is way more than you would need. Instead, I would recommend a camera that is more affordable. It's great for beginners, but it does have some pro features that we talked about in this review, and that is the Sony A6600. So make sure that you watch my review on the A6600 right here, and of course don't forget to hit subscribe and a notification bell so you won't miss out on new videos.